Welcome back. So now the time has come to finally start building our API. So this lecture is really going to be the first step in a long journey of building this main course project. And let me actually start by showing you again the project that we're talking about. So this is the Nators project. It's basically an application where we can see tours and also book them. We can create user accounts, we can log in, and really do all kinds of different stuff. So for example, we can take a look at the tour here. It has all these details, this map. It has reviews from other users that are using the platform, and we can even book the tour then. We would have to log in before we are able to book, and I'm not going to do that now because it's just a very simple demo here. So I just wanted to show you this graphical interface basically of the project that we are building. Now this part that you're seeing here is actually the part that we're going to build by the end of the course, because this first part of the course is to build an API using the exact same data that you see here on this dynamic website. So again, we start by building the API and then the dynamically rendered website. And I choose to do it like this because this way we don't have to mix all these different concepts all together. So in order to learn Express and Mongo and Mongoose, I find it much easier to just work with data and not worry about the graphical stuff, even though that's maybe a bit more exciting because you get to see the real results in this beautiful interface. But to learn, it's better to, again, simply just deal with the data itself and worry about making it beautiful later. Okay, so let me actually show you the API as well. And for that, of course, I use Postman. Create a new tab here. And so the final API we access at /API/version1. And then, for example, we can take a look at tours. So we use the GET request, and then we get all of these different tours, right? So again, the exact same tours that you saw on the graphical interface, so on the rendered website before. Okay, we can then also go ahead, take the ID, and request only that ID. So only that tour for that ID. And so you see that now we only have this one here with even more data than we had before. So we have start locations here. We have tour guides, which in turn has other IDs. We have locations. We have reviews. So all of that we have in a tour. So you see it's really advanced stuff. And so we actually have more than just tours. We have users, but we will not be able to access them because we need to be authenticated. So you're not logged in, and so right now we would need to log into our app. Now at this point, I'm going to stop showing you all the features because we will build this throughout the course, just to show you that there is really a lot going on here. And so there is a lot of material and of stuff to learn ahead of you. So I hope you're excited for that and that you want to take the first step with me right now. So let's go back and implement the tours route, or starting to implement it at least. Okay, so this piece of code here we no longer need, and I'm not deleting it, just commenting it out. So again, we use app.get because in this lecture we're going to start by just handling the GET request. And the URL will be /API and tours. So I'm not using v1. Well, I could use v1 right away. So it's a good practice to specify the API version. Okay, so that in case you want to do some changes to your API, you can do that, but simply then on v2 without breaking everyone who is still using v1. Okay, so basically you can branch off, create a new version of your API, but old users can then still be using it. If we did it just like this, and you did changes then to API/tours, then the users who started to use it before you did the change would run into some problem. Okay? So we always should specify the version of the API. We could also do it in a subdomain, but it's easier to just simply include it in the URL. Okay, and then of course, our route handler. So this is how we usually call this function. We call it the route handler. Okay, so just to get familiar with these Express terms. Now, what do we want to do when someone hits this route? Well, we want to simply send back all the tours. So that is similar to what we just learned in the last lecture, right? We have this URL or this endpoint /tours, and that will usually send back all of the data for that resource, right? So also tours is the resource now. And I'm starting with tours here because it's, well, I would say the most obvious one since we're building a website or a web application for selling tours, right? Now, where do we actually get these tours that we want to send back to the client? Well, it's here in the dev data folder, then data, and then tours, simple. So it's this JSON file, and it's very similar to the one that we had for the node farm. So again, it's an array of JSON objects, which then has a bunch of data about each of the tours. And so, yeah, that's the data that we're going to be sending to the client. Now, before we can send the data, we actually need to first read it. And so, again, we don't do it inside the route handler, but we do it before. Okay? And just like I explained in the previous project, we can do that because the top level code is only executed once, which is right after the application startup, right? And now that you know all about the event loop, it makes even more sense for you at this point, right? So only this callback function, for example, here will run inside the event loop. And so in here, we cannot have any blocking code, but outside it is no problem at all. So let's simply read the tours into a variable outside of all of this in a synchronous way. So fs, and for that, of course, we need to require the module actually. And so we do that here at the top. And I like to always start with the core modules. And so I do that at the first one. So require fs. So fs read file sync, it's already here. And now let's use the dir name. And so again, at this point, you already know why we actually have access to this variable here. So dir name is the folder where the current script is located, and so that is this main folder. So from here, we need to move into dev data, then into data, and then in there we have tours simple.json. Okay, and now let's also write in this step here, parse the result of this. So JSON, actually the uppercase one, so JSON.parse, so that the JSON that we have in here will automatically be converted to a JavaScript object, or an array of JavaScript objects, actually. So saving it, and so this will reformat it. And so now all we have to do is to really send it back to the client. So res.json, and let me actually specify the status code here. Even if 200 is the standard, I like to do it in each and every single response. All right. So JSON, and what do we want to send back now? Not message, that's for sure. So what do we want to send back? Well, remember that we were going to use the JSON formatting standard. Okay, and so in there we specify a status. So status, and that can either be success, fail, or error. Okay, so success is obvious. It's when we have a 200 code, or 201, or really just any code that starts with 200. Then we have the fail, which is an error at the client. And then we also have error when there was an error at the server. All right, but we are going to use these a bit later. Anyway, we also have then the data property, which is, as I mentioned, the so-called envelope for our data. So we specify the data property, and that data will then in turn have an object which then contains the data, so the response that we actually want to send. And in this case, that is tours. So tours, and then tours, which is the same name in this case. So with ES6, we actually do not need to specify the key and the value if they have the same name. So we could just write tours. But I just wanted to specify it here that I wrote tours here because, well, that is the name of the resource and of the endpoint. And so that's why inside of data, I then send back an object that has the tour property. Okay, so if this was called X, for example, then I would call this one here X, but here I would still need to say tours. Okay, I'm putting it back to tours because that makes more sense. And now I can delete this here and just leave it like this. And that is actually all we have to do. So we read our data and then we formatted our response like this here using the JSON data specification. Okay, so very simple stuff. Let's now just test it out. And we now have to change, of course, the URL. So we have /API/version1 and tours. So that is our URL. We still do a GET request. Okay, so that's the one that we are responding to in code. So remember using this GET method. And so hit send. And indeed, here we go. So here we have all our tours. So awesome. That's really cool. Really, really nice work. Now, just to finish, something else that I like to do usually when we are sending multiple responses is to include a field called results with the number of results that we are sending. Okay? And this is not really part of the JSON specification, but I still really like to do it because that makes it very easy for the client to get a very quick information about the data it is receiving. So we know that tours is an array, and so all we have to do is to say tours.length. Okay? And this actually only makes sense whenever we are sending an array, so multiple objects. If we only were sending like one tour, then it wouldn't make sense to have results set to 1, right? And so I only do this whenever we're sending an array with multiple objects in there. So let's do that again. And indeed, we have 9 results. Then we have the data property, then in there tours to specify that we're sending tours, and then an array with all the 9 tours in there. So you see another object, and another one, and all the way to the end. So that is the very first step to our API. Of course, this is at this point it's like a file-based API, so we're reading this data from an API, but later, of course, we're going to store this data in a database and then read it from there. But anyway, this already looks kind of real, and that for sure makes me feel really good. And I hope it makes you feel good as well. So that's it for the GET request. Next up, we're going to take care of the POST request so that we can actually add a new tour to our data.